Hi, this video is going to be the first in a series of videos about feminism, and so in it and in the first few videos of this series I'd like to just share some of my general thoughts on the term and hopefully lay a foundation for future discussions on this topic. One main goal that I have is to hopefully go beyond simply rehearsing a dictionary definition of the term and rather to offer people what I think are some useful tools for thinking about feminism. Now, I think that this is especially important when dealing with a term like feminism because of how controversial it is. For those who know anything about it, you know that the debates which surround the different topics that feminism brings up can give rise to some very strong and harsh disagreements, and things can get pretty heated from time to time. And I hopefully will be able to offer a way of reflecting upon feminism that will help us make sense of this controversy and hopefully organize our thoughts about it, especially in a setting where things can be pretty messy. So hopefully this will work out. I do want to point out that this controversy or these different perspectives may seem a little bit odd to an uninformed outsider, and a lot of this is because when you look at the dictionary definition of the term, you tend to get something along the lines of the belief in the equality of the sexes or a movement to end sexist oppression. There's some variation that you get, but it's typically something along those lines. And if that's all that there is to feminism, then it seems as if feminism is a good thing and that we all should be feminists. And yet the term certainly is very divisive, and there are a lot of people who reject the label, and there are a lot of people who criticize feminism. And I think it's worth reflecting and questioning why does this controversy exist? Why are there such strong disagreements? And why do some people choose to identify as feminists, whereas others do not? So hopefully, in this video and in the next few that follow, I'll be able to shed some light on what I think are answers to these questions. And as far as this video goes, I'm going to focus primarily on, trying to examine the variation that occurs within feminism. And simply put, this is simply the idea that feminism can vary based upon how much feminists want to change society. On one end of the spectrum, you might have those who simply want to implement modest tweaks, whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have those who want to implement more fundamental changes. I think that examining the idea of equality can help illustrate how this might operate. Again, you might have feminists who are simply pursuing equality within the current system that exists. And from this perspective, you're simply looking at disparities between men and women and trying to eliminate them. If men can vote and if women cannot, you might perceive this as an injustice and try to grant women the right to vote as well. And again, this isn't implementing very large changes to society. It's simply implementing modest tweaks to bring about equality in a number of different domains. There are, however, some who might criticize this idea of equality, and they may typically, critique it by pointing out how vague it can be. Consider a somewhat silly example, but imagine if I were to go into work and I were to steal $1 from all of my, coworkers. You could say in the sense that I treated everyone equally, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I treated everyone well. And I think that this, just goes to show that, in a society, equality can mean equally good, equality can mean equally bad, it can mean somewhere in between. And whenever someone talks about equality, it's probably worth inquiring, equality with what? Now, when it comes to society, there are some feminists who think that there are some deep-seated problems with how society is structured, and so from their perspective, it would be suboptimal to simply pursue equality within a system that is already flawed. And rather than do that, it would be more productive or it would be more conducive towards producing optimal results if we were to simply try to restructure the way in which society is built at its very core. And from this perspective, it's simply a way of addressing the way in which sexism and oppression and discrimination operate in society, and tackling these problems at their very root causes. A specific example I think can help illustrate this. Consider the controversies that exist around gender. On one hand, you might have those who simply want to implement modest critiques to gender, or modest critiques about gender. And from their perspective, a lot of this deals with simply trying to make sure that men and women have equal rights and equal opportunities in society. And they may want to, sort of break down some of the rigid gender stereotypes and rigid gender roles that exist. And this is, again, not implementing very large-scale changes. It's simply just trying to make sure that people are treated fairly in society and that they're free to make whatever lifestyle choices they want to make. There are, however, some who, although acknowledging some of the good points in this more modest critique, might also say that it doesn't go far enough. And part of the reason why is because it still seems to assume what we could call a gender binary. And a gender binary is this idea that, there are two genders, men and women, and you're either one or the other. And, this perspective might acknowledge that that could be the case, but it may also say that this is an oversimplified conception of gender, and it is an inadequate conception of gender, and that, although you could be a man and you could be a woman, you may also be both, you may be neither, you may transition from one to another in a somewhat fluid manner. There are a number of different terms that have been, used to describe some of these new ways of thinking about gender, such as, gender creative, gender non-conforming, gender, non-binary. Again, this is kind of a complicated issue in its own right, but the main point for this video is to simply point out that this is leveling more basic critiques of gender. It's forcing us to ask questions like, what is gender? How many genders are there? And, what determines a person's gender, or what makes a person a particular gender? The criticism of gender may also go one step further. And this critique might be implemented by those who think that gender has no place in society. From their perspective, gender is a way of categorizing people that creates a somewhat hierarchical class-like system, and or perhaps I should say hierarchical caste-like system. And from their perspective, the solution to the problems that accompany gender in this society are best resolved by abolishing gender altogether. Now, I think it's important to notice the continuum which has emerged when it comes to discussing gender. On one hand, you have those who accept that gender should exist and accept the gender binary, but they simply think that we should modify the way in which the gender binary functions in society. Then you have those who reject the gender binary, but still accept the existence of gender. And then, of course, on the most extreme end of the spectrum, you have those who think that gender should be abolished altogether. I think it's also worth noting that the specific views that someone holds on this topic are influenced by other beliefs that they might have. So in feminism, there's a lot of debate over the question of, why are there differences between men and women, especially in the psychological and behavioral realms. And, very, in a very simplified way of trying to give you just a brief sense of what the different perspectives are. On one hand, you tend to have people who tend to focus on biological factors and think that the differences arise from biological differences between men and women. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those who tend to focus more on social influences and social factors. And from their perspective, the disparities and the differences between men and women which we observe in society are primarily the result of the way in which we raise boys and girls, and the different roles and expectations that we as a society impose upon them. And again, without really taking sides on this issue or going into the details of it, it is worth noting that the views that someone holds on this issue tend to influence the specific viewpoints which they have on gender. And it tends to influence, how they think gender should manifest itself in society, and what the solution to the problems which surround gender ought to be. And again, this is I think an important point to realize, because it can be very easy when there's a contested issue, or when there's an emotionally heated issue at hand. It can be very easy to simply critique the claim that's being made, or critique the specific viewpoint that's being espoused. And we might do that to the neglect of really understanding what this person believes, why they believe it, and we might not necessarily take the time to understand what other beliefs are informing the specific viewpoint that they may be holding. And so, I think that it can be, worthwhile to take the time to get a sense of why people believe what they believe and get a sense of how their beliefs work together as a system rather than simply trying to address their beliefs as they occur in isolation. So that's pretty much it for this video. I think the main takeaways that I'm trying to emphasize are that, there's a lot of variation that exists within feminism. It is not a homogeneous entity. And I think that what this implies is that the term might not necessarily be as informative as we think it is. And, when someone identifies as a feminist, or if they don't identify as a feminist, it might be worthwhile to inquire further about what their views actually are. As I've tried to illustrate in this video, feminism can vary depending upon how much one wants to change society. And, you have some who simply want to implement modest tweaks, whereas others are really questioning the very basis and the very foundations of society. And so, again, there's a lot of variation, and unfortunately, I think there can be a tendency for some people to use what I see as a very complicated term in a very loose and general manner. And I think that at least having an appreciation for the complexity that's somewhat inherent in the term feminism can help us sort of sort out our disagreements and not make unjustified assumptions about what people believe simply based upon the label that they apply to themselves. So that's pretty much it for this video. Again, I'll probably make a couple other videos discussing some different aspects of feminism, but that's all for this one. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.